Hey guys, and welcome back to History Mysteries, where I talk about interesting and little known facts covering historical happenings from ancient times through to modern history. This week I am talking about the Cyclops, the mythical one-eyed giant, and giving you an insight into how the myth of the Cyclops might have come about. Hope you enjoy it. Throughout time, there have been many mythical animals, and there is generally a good basis for their origins. For example, unicorns are probably based on rhinos, basilisks are just scary cobras, mermaids are based on manatees, yes, I know, and kraken are somehow the even scarier version of the giant squid. But what about the Cyclops, the one-eyed giant of Greek mythology? What's the basis for that story? Unlike some of the mythical creatures I've just mentioned, the Cyclops features from the earliest Greek mythology. They also feature in later Roman mythology. The Cyclopes, which means round eyes, the singular is Cyclops, are giant one-eyed creatures. The earliest mention of them is as far back as the 7th century BC, when Hesiod's Theogony includes them, explaining that the Cyclopes were so called because a single circle-shaped eye was set in their foreheads. Also in the 7th century BC, the Cyclopes are mentioned by Homer as a group of giant, one-eyed, man-eating shepherds. Homer goes on in the Odyssey to talk further about the Cyclopes, talking about Polyphemus, the one-eyed giant son of Poseidon. Polyphemus means abounding in songs, and he first appears in the 9th book of the Odyssey. Homer also describes the Cyclopes as men overweening in pride who plundered their neighbours continually. They lived on an island that Odysseus and some of his men visited in search of supplies. And according to Homer, the Cyclopes have no ships, nor other craftsmen, and know nothing of agriculture. They have no regard for Zeus or the other gods. So briefly, to the story of Odysseus and the Cyclops in this adapted extract. During his travels home from the Trojan War, Odysseus lands on the island of the Cyclopes, and together with some of his men, enters a cave in search of supplies or treasure. When the giant Polyphemus returns home with his sheep flocks, he blocks the entrance with a great stone, and scoffing at the idea of hospitality, eats 2 men for supper. Next morning, the giant kills and eats 2 more for breakfast, and leaves the cave to graze his sheep, placing the great stone back in place. The giant returns that evening and eats 2 more of the men. Odysseus offers Polyphemus some strong, undiluted wine. Drunk and unwary, the giant asks Odysseus his name. Odysseus tells him Hootis, meaning nobody, and Polyphemus promises to eat this nobody last of all. When Polyphemus sleeps, Odysseus sharpens and hardens a wooden stake in the fire and drives it into Polyphemus's eye. When Polyphemus shouts for help from his fellow giants, they don't come because all they hear is that nobody is hurting him. In the morning, the blind Cyclops lets the sheep out to graze, feeling their backs to ensure that the men are not escaping. However, Odysseus and his men are holding on to the undersides of the animals, so they escape and run to the ships. However, being the sons of Poseidon is not the only ancient origin of the Cyclopes. An alternative myth says that they are the sons of Gaia and Uranus, the earth and the sky. 3 Cyclops brothers became the blacksmiths of the Olympian gods, creating Zeus's thunderbolts and Poseidon's trident. The Cyclopes were also said to have built the walls of Mycenae and Argos, being described as craftsmen of supernatural skill, possessing enormous strength. In Cyclops, the 5th century BC play by Euripides, a chorus of satyrs recount the grisly story of how Polyphemus was punished for his impious behaviour in not respecting Xenia, the rules of hospitality. In his Latin epic, the Aeneid, specifically Book 3, Virgil describes how Aeneas observes the blind Polyphemus as he leads his flocks down to the sea. they encounter Achaemenides, which means left behind in Greek, who retells the story of how Odysseus and his men escaped, leaving him behind. The many tellings of various stories covering the Cyclopes, especially the vivid nature of the Polyphemus episode, made it a favourite theme of ancient Greek pottery, and the scenes most often illustrated are the blinding of the Cyclops and the ruse by which Odysseus and his men escape. So, if there is a background to the myth of the Cyclopes, what could be the source, and where is the science to back this up? To most paleontologists today, if you showed them the skull of a woolly mammoth, the large hole in the centre of the skull would suggest a pronounced trunk. However, to the ancient Greeks, similar skulls could well be the foundation for their tales of the fearsome one-eyed Cyclops. You have to remember that the ancient Greeks were not actually looking at living woolly mammoths, but at the skeletal remains, especially the skull. So, could mammoths and similar animals have lived in southeastern Europe? Yes. A cousin to the woolly mammoth, Venopheres, roamed Europe, Asia, and Africa from 23 million to 1.8 million years ago, before becoming extinct. To give you some scale, the skull of Venophyrium giganteum was many times bigger than today's elephant, with an extremely large nasal opening in the centre of the skull. However, most species of mammoth were only about as large as the modern Asian elephant, which are about half the size of the Dinotherium, 2.5 to 3 metres high at the shoulder. The last of the mammoths were generally assumed to have vanished around 12,000 years ago, but new findings show that some were still present in Europe and Siberia around 10,000 years ago. So is it possible that the very ancient Greeks came across the skulls of these creatures? We know that a tusk, several teeth, and the bones of a Dinotherium giganteum have been found on the Greek island of Crete. This animal stood 15 feet, 4.6 metres tall at the shoulder, and had tusks that were 4.5 feet, 1.3 metres long. It was one of the largest mammals to ever walk the face of the earth. Finding the remains on Crete suggests that the mammal moved around larger areas of Europe than was previously believed. The animals could have reached Crete from Turkey, swimming and island hopping around the southern Aegean Sea during periods when the sea levels were lower. These types of animals, like modern-day elephants, would have been exceptionally strong swimmers. The idea that skull remains from this family of creatures could be the origin for the one-eyed Cyclopes was advanced by Austrian paleontologist Othenio Abel in 1914. Abel proposed that the fossil skulls of dwarf elephants, commonly found in coastal caves of Italy and Greece, may have given rise to the Polyphemus story. Abel suggested that the large central nasal cavity in the skull, or the trunk, might have been interpreted as a large single eye socket. One particular species that may have prompted this was the Paleoloxodon falconeri, or the Sicilian dwarf elephant. Paleoloxodon falconeri's ancestors most likely reached the Mediterranean islands, including Malta and Sicily, when the sea levels were around 100 metres, just over 300 feet, lower than they are today. That would significantly have reduced distances required to swim and also opened land bridges, allowing the animals to wander more easily between the European mainland and the islands. We also know that dwarf elephants inhabited the Mediterranean islands during the Pleistocene, often colloquially referred to as the Ice Age, and remains have been found on Sardinia, Sicily, Malta, Crete, Cyprus, the Cyclades Islands, including Delos and Naxos, and Rhodes. As the Ice Age came to an end, around 11,700 years ago, sea levels rose, stranding elephants on the islands. It is then likely that over time, an evolutionary process called insular dwarfism led to Paleoloxodon falconeri. Insular dwarfism is the process of large animals evolving a reduced body size when their population's range is limited to islands. This process has occurred many times throughout evolutionary history, and there are other examples of this with elephants. So, through the evolutionary process within the mammoth family and the geological evolution of the planet, we can now posit that on various islands across the southern Mediterranean, we have species of mammoths or elephants that would leave skull remains that could well be interpreted many years later as coming from a giant with a single eye socket. So when the ancients wrote of the Cyclopes, is there any indication as to where they lived? Well, Homer is vague as to their location, although it is to the west of Greece. Euripides locates the land of the Cyclopes as the island of Sicily, beside Mount Etna. In the same play, he addresses Hephaestus as Lord of Etna. The historian Thucydides says that the earliest inhabitants of Sicily were reputed to be the Cyclopes. He further suggests that the fire and smoke seen rising from the volcano was due to the Cyclopes' forge underneath. From the 3rd century BC poet Callimachus, the 3 Hesiodic Cyclopes, called Brontes, Steropes, and Arges, the first 2 names become fixed, the third changes by author, became assistants at the forge of the blacksmith god Hephaestus in the Aeolian Islands off the coast of Sicily. The Cyclopes make Artemis's bow, arrows, and quiver. In turn, the 1st century BC Latin poet Virgil, in his epic the Aeneid, has the Cyclopes work under Vulcan the smith, the Roman Hephaestus, in caves underneath Mount Etna and the Aeolian Islands, making thunderbolts, a chariot for Mars, and Athena's shield, the Aegis. Several poetic episodes concerning Polyphemus take place in other poetry on the island of Sicily. Most notably, Ovid set the love story of Polyphemus and Galatea there, which he recounted in the Metamorphoses. Similar to Callimachus, Ovid also has the Hesiodic Cyclopes, Brontes and Steropes, along with a third Cyclops, work at forges in Sicilian caves. So did a one-eyed, man-eating shepherd giant ever exist? Just like mermaids, kraken and unicorns, they certainly appear to have existed in the minds of man. And I hope you can see from today that there was actually a great possibility that the myth was based on the ancient Greeks finding mysterious skulls, much larger than a human skull, and wondering just why there was only one hole in the middle of the forehead. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, let me know in the comments what other strange historical origins you'd like me to cover, and please remember to subscribe. For details on upcoming videos and shorter history facts, follow me on Instagram or Twitter, links in the description.